welcome to Sermon Q&A. Pastor Michael here with you. I'm in the studio with Pastor Craig and Pastor Alex on May 8th, 2022. These gentlemen preached a sermon in our series, Jesus Is. The emphasis of that message was on Jesus being the Son of Man, having all authority. So Pastor Alex, we're gonna take this question and we're gonna go in, I think, an interesting direction. Good luck. Should the church take back control of social welfare programs? And there's just a little assumption here, which is throughout the vast majority of history, governments really didn't care for poor people a whole lot.
Right.
I mean, the American experiment is one of the first ones to highly prioritize elevating, caring for the poor in this way. So the church used to do a lot.
Yes.
Now the government does 99% of all welfare programs.
Right.
Is this good? Is this bad? Should we take back control?
Okay. Well, then that's a different question. Is this good? Is this bad? Overall, I don't think it's good that the church is stepping out of the, taking care of the vulnerable, right? That we have somehow allowed ourselves to take a back seat because the government has it now is not okay, right? But because we have stepped out, the government has stepped in to kind of fill the holes that were left, right? So there's that reality. But when we talk about taking back control, I'm going to say no, that we shouldn't try to take back control because the government's going to do what the government's going to do. We have no necessary kind of say over what the government's going to do.
You are American, right?
We have a Canadian
Well, we
here.
do. We can vote a particular way, but I am saying as the church operates and what we do, we shouldn't let the government, what it does or does not do, make our decisions, right? And so the church should be actively and significantly engaged in social welfare. And I think for what it's worth, we can, at least where we live, we can see ourselves as partners to a certain extent with especially local governments and that kind of stuff to step into vulnerable situations. So just a side note, I think this is an important question because government is remarkably inefficient at doing anything. And especially when you put something like the care of the vulnerable in the government's hands, that is not going to happen in an effective or an efficient way. And so there's that reality. But then from a theological perspective, we just can't trust any kind of government not to bring sinfulness into the situation, not to let their sinfulness leak out. And so sinful people will always be running sinful governments. It's ludicrous to think that it's reasonable to leave all kind of general welfare, the whole slate of it, in the government's hands. So and this is what led us to say, no person sitting in a church should be satisfied with the idea that oh, I don't have to do that because the government's going to take care of that. Oh, I don't have to care for these vulnerable people or even put some kind of effort. When I have a thought oh, somebody should do something about that, I don't wait for my government to step in and do it, right? I work together with the other Christians in my sphere and we start asking questions about how can we address this, right? So yeah.
Interesting. So I think I have a different perspective.
I'm sure you do.
Yeah. No, it's not contradictory.
Sure.
It's just, I would look at our government's reach into welfare systems as part of the legacy of the Judeo-Christian foundations of America. So when we think about building some sort of governmental structure, right?
Yep.
That is loosely built on Judeo-Christian values, loosely, we'll say tightly. And so what do you look at in ancient Israel? You see that built into the law is a collaboration between the people and the government on basically welfare, although it's very different, right?
Right.
And it strikes me that even the impulse for the American government to care for the poor in the way they have strikes me as a good thing. But I think we're so I'm not disagreeing. It's it actually, to me, I look at that.
The value comes from a good place, and that it would not be even in our American system if Christians did not exist in the American system.
I would also add that I agree with both of you. And the challenge, I think, the challenge, I think, with what you're saying, Michael, is that, yes, it was built into the system, but they actually went to Babylon in captivity for one of the main reasons. They stopped taking care of the poor.
Yeah, for sure.
So they started building their own economy on the back, themselves on the backs of the poor. When we read Ruth, for instance, she's out gathering wheat that is supposed to be left behind in order to take care of the needs of the poor. It's built into the system. But if you don't fear God, there's no incentive for you to keep following the system. Whereas in the American economy in which we live today, I'm not sure there's much incentive for people to actually, like you said, as politicians, follow through with our responsibility to take care of the poor,
Right.
like we should.
Yeah, I think the point's being made that in this structure, no structure is ever going to be able to do this well.
Yes.
And in an ideal world, it strikes me that there is some kind of governmental impulse to provide for the poor. And there is also an individual impulse to provide for my neighbors or my family or the people in my community, my village, if you will, that kind of collaboration. But what's happened is the government has basically taken complete control and it's become obese functionally.
Absolutely. Even to the point where
infrastructure.
certain governments are even now pushing churches out because churches have certain theological convictions that the government doesn't like.
Yeah.
So they work to keep the church out of it. which
And
is
then
really
they
interesting.
insert their own
Right.
worldview into whatever they're doing. So not only are they providing now for the poor, but they're also adding extra programs and things that God would simply not support. And it's all becomes one major thing. A friend of mine just accepted a position as a part of a team that's working in downtown Chicago. And they're reaching the poor, and they're pulling people from Afghanistan and Ukraine and pulling them over and relocating them, and they're helping with gun violence and all kinds of good stuff like that. But included, because it's a government program, included with that is he has to support the LGBT community as a part of the equality
He can have,
program.
like his theological, he kind of had to put theological convictions on the back burner.
Okay,
as a
but if-
participant
it becomes
in
a
the
challenge.
If you're a church downtown, would you not want to make inroads and somehow figure out how to support that community?
Absolutely.
Right. But
Yeah.
he probably has to give a verbal affirmation
Right.
of it, right?
Yeah.
Okay,
Right.
that's
It's one
that's
thing
a challenge.
to help those in need. It's another thing to be forced to support something that the Lord would not support.
Yeah, I mean, as we focus back on this question, in any world where the church tries to take back control of this stuff, there's so much entitlement now because the system it basically builds addicts to the system, right? And it meets real needs in the process, but it's like, what is that little problem?
Well, and that's
Teach a man to
why I
fish.
said the whole thing about partnership, right? Because there's a reality where the system is what it is now. So
Undoing that is
right, we're
impossible,
not going
short
to
of
undo
the-
that. We should not try to undo that, but we can step in where we can step in and still do what we're called to do as the church. Right. So I think that's really important. So so James chapter 1, we know this passage, but it talks about pure and undefiled religion is this, that we would care for widows and orphans, like the most vulnerable. Right. And I think it's even interesting as we think about what does it mean for us to own that responsibility, that we would even add categories to that. And this is what I mean. There are categories that exist today that did not exist when James wrote that passage, right? So like we have just an awareness of the reality of special needs in our communities, right? That's a place where we can step in and care for the vulnerable. We also have like elderly, like the world has never had before, right? People are living longer and living longer into the reality where they're more unable to do for themselves. But if we value life, like we should be caring for the elderly as well. So I think those are some categories that we can add to that. And I just like want to celebrate something that Village Church does and that we've had the joy of being able to partner with. You guys do BC3, which is partnering with the local police, partnering with local government, and finding ways to people have needs to just repair things in their house or take care of plumbing issues or even just like mow their lawn or we have elderly in this community who can't do some basic things for themselves. And so BC3 enables people to sign up to volunteer to help out with these different needs. And I think that is like one significant way where we can take ownership of our responsibility and also say there are some good things that our community cares about and we want to figure out how to help our values align on these things.
And in our village, I think there's a principle that you're going after, which is really, I think it's really good, which is the church needs to think about where they're placed.
Yeah.
And so the default for most people is, I'm going to call my government to fix some things. The amount of phone calls our police and fire get, which they should never be called. Honestly, their family should be called or their church should be called. So when we called them, we just said, give it all to us. Like if it's not something that you should be doing, we'll do all of it, whatever it is. And so we get a whole bunch of weird, random things. And because these people, what's interesting is most of them don't have family. They don't have community. They do not have a church. And so the only person that they know to call is their government. And we're like, well, we'll just take
Step
that.
in.
And they were happy. They were thrilled. They're like, you'll do it. We don't have to do all this stuff. We can actually do our job, And I'm like, yeah.
Along
you
those
just-
lines, my wife is a teacher, and she has little kids that she teaches, and one of them got ticked off at her the other day, and the kid actually said, "I'm going to call the police on you," because that's all he knew.
That's all I knew.
That's the only thing that could come and help him get his way with her.
That's so good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it's worth saying just like that the idea of like even the value that people would be cared for.
Yep.
It's amazing that that exists. It is actually like, I think it is a miracle that that value exists broadly within a society, because it did not exist for a very long time. And the reason it exists is because Christians cared for and took care of the responsibilities that they were given by God in the first place.
Well, let it be said of the churches in a community to do whatever it can to relieve the load of the government and actually meet tangible needs.
Yes.
Or let it be said of the Christian family that the people in my neighborhood that live near me, let it be said that they're
cared for.
They're cared for if they need it. And let it be said of our families that our families, our parents, our grandparents, our children are cared for really well, because it does start at home, and that works itself out. So that's awesome. Thank you for that. Well, I want to thank you for joining us on Sermon Q&A. We've got plenty more to come and many more disagreements also while we're at it.